So good morning, everyone. On behalf of SDPI team, I wish to thank you for your time today. I welcome all of you to this online meeting on on Pakistan in digital trade, challenges and opportunities. This dialogue series, as some of you know, is part of SDPI's Strengthening the Use of Evidence for Development Impact SETI program, in which we are also collaborating with the Ministry of Commerce, FBR and SAMIDA. And for this particular session, we also have our team working with the UN SCAP, who helped us in putting together the themes and discussion points for today's meeting. The objective of meeting today is basically to look at the specific areas of digital economy and how policy and regulatory facilitation stands currently and how it could help going forward. And all panelists have been provided some relevant questions relevant to their current roles, but of course revolving around this subject. A bit on the housekeeping announcement. We've requested the panelists to give initial views on the questions shared for around 7 to 8 minutes. That will be their initial response, and of course we'll come back to them later during the discussion. Of course, we encourage the other members as well as members who are not speaking to continue the discussion in the chat box or post any of the questions or further comments for advice in the chat box. You, of course, may find me prompting, but only in the interest of timekeeping. This meeting will be recorded, and the video will be available for you to revisit the discussion. And please feel free to share with your network. The proceedings for today's meeting are expected to be inputs for SAMIDA's ongoing work with regards to draft SME policy, State Bank's work on SME finance policy, as well as the deliberations of provincial e-commerce councils, which some of you are part of. And let me quickly introduce our panelists for today. We are being joined by Mr. Parvez Iftikhar Sahab, who's Member Prime Minister Task Force on IT, and he's founding CEO of Universal Service Fund at Ministry of IT and Telecom. Mr. Arif Sargana is a professional economist, currently serving as Director General at Pakistan Telecom Regulatory Authority. Mr. Usman Nasir is Managing Director of Pakistan Software Export Board, PSEB. Ms. Saira Khalid is working with Barker Gillette Global Alliance with experience in international law and intellectual property. Mr. Gonzalo is a senior economist in the macroeconomics, trade and investment global practice of the World Bank, currently also serving as lead on trade in World Bank Pakistan office. Mr. Rafi Khan is associated with the World Bank Pakistan team as an economist. Before I pass on to our panelists, just very quickly to bring everyone on the same page, just want to share two very quick thoughts on today's priority areas. Just so that we, as well as those who are relatively new to the discussion in the audience, understand that today's definition for the digital economy will comprise of three main areas. One, of course, is the IT and ICT sector. The digital goods and services in the economy, and the physical goods produced and traded using the digital technology. This is just so that all are on the same page. Second, I think conceptually it's important to link in today's discussion how digital economy could be helped by improved trade rules, regulations in ICT and IT sector, and how this in turn could lead to a stronger digital infrastructure moving forward. And of course, it has a circular impact which further augments the digital economy. And lastly, there are three main areas for today, which each one of you would be focusing on. First, of course, facilitating firms by engaging in cross-border e-commerce. While there's a lot of focus on the in-country e-commerce, I think cross-border e-commerce is something which we'll be very interested in today's discussion. Second, making digital technologies accessible and affordable for all. And finally, having rules and regulations on digital technologies in line with international practice. So I'll stop over here and probably let me start with Mr. Parvez Iftikhar Sir for his initial remarks. Parvez Sir, it's over to you, please.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you very much, Pakar and SDPI, for giving this opportunity. I must make a disclaimer to start with, that my basic field of expertise is telecom. So although we are closely related here with the digital, in case of IT and digital trade, it is not something completely way out, but I'm sure there are many more better qualified people to speak on the topic in the panel as well as among the audiences. So I don't consider myself to be an expert in this, maybe on telecom a little bit. But anyway, I will present my submissions. The rules and regulations that hinder foreign investment in digital space is the first question that has been asked from me. I think the usual ease of doing business issues, which are well known and to everybody and are discussed at several forums. I don't think I need to repeat them here, but they are ease of doing business is the first. Or the issues related with either doing business are the first constraints that one has to look at. Then the State Bank of Pakistan related rather conservative regulations in which taking the money out by a foreign investor is extremely difficult, is a big hindrance. Repatriation of profit is also not so easy. Every small transaction has to be checked and confirmed by State Bank of Pakistan. And any foreign equity which tries to come in has to be approved by State Bank of Pakistan, where security clearances are also involved. So answers to questions of investors have to be sought manually. This is another issue because there are no fixed preset processes for to answer the questions of those who are coming from outside, for trading from outside. There are also restrictions by PTA. I think Sargana Saab will be able to speak more on that. If a foreign investor, for example, wants to invest in manufacturing of ICT devices, he also needs permissions from PTA. And they also include security clearances. Then a potential investor would like to look at the market size, which the market size owes a lot to the government spending in ICT. And the government spending in ICT in Pakistan, unfortunately, is not too big. This makes the digital market appear to be not so lucrative in our country. Other constraints transitioning towards digital trade, in my opinion, are the structural issues regarding availability and reliability of data. For example, the trade-related data is not available in digitized form. And if whatever is digitized, it is not shared. For example, foreign ICT trading partners like to look deep into the internet penetration data, like city-wise, gender-wise, age-wise. That all is not available. Some broad data is of course available. Then the same is the case with agri-related data, and so on. And sharing of data in a proper format, in proper manner, like EDI, for example, is not possible. There is a lot of data available with PRAL, with NADRA, with Safe City, etc., but it is not shared. Rather, they all want to make profit of it from themselves, for themselves. And NADRA charges very high for use of their data. I, being a member of the PM task force, we have been trying to convinced Nadra to reduce their charges for biometric verification, which is required in case of SIM. But they do not budge, and their argument is that since they issue the first ID card free, they have to make money from somewhere. So they charge exorbitantly, and so far they have charged that amount in case of 165 million plus SIMs. And most of the equipment was funded by the telecom operators, but that is not enough. So sharing of data is sometimes not ideal. Then the cashless transactions in the country, which would make the whole thing viable and more attractive for somebody coming from outside, are not too, it's still a cash-based economy. And the problem is, which I see, the government is not doing enough to push aggressively towards cashless economy. I think government could obligate public services to receive only cashless payments and fees. Similarly, attestation of documents could be done electronically rather than, you have to run around with documents and looking for people, finding people who can attest those. Or going to the offices which are meant for attestations in Foreign Office and everywhere else. So the lack of cashless transactions is another constraint for end-to-end digital trade. Coming to national and foreign IT companies, treatment of national and foreign IT companies, well, it is not equal, but it is unequal in another way. It's not that it's against foreign companies, but let me explain. The first priority of the government is public sector IT companies. So PRAL, NRTC, NTC, etc., etc. They a lot of times do not have to pass through competition also, and even if they have to, they save on bid bonds and things like that, which makes others non-competitive. The second priority, it appears to be the international companies are supported by donors. Now, a company, if it has a donor behind, then they can also get away without competition a lot of times. So it appears that the government organizations do not have confidence in their project management capabilities. So what they do is they rely completely on big names, international names, project management, and a side benefit is that it keeps NAB out. And then comes the private companies, the local private companies. And even among the local private companies, which are mainly SMEs, there are those who are, agents of other bigger international companies. Among the local companies, they get a preference. So the treatment of the government is quite unequal. The last legislative requirements, of course, the first and foremost legislative requirement is the data protection law that is awaited for some years. It is still on the website of MOIT. It has seen different forms. It has you have a lot of people have contributed towards giving some inputs, and it has changed a lot in between. But it is still to become a law. Then there is a cyber security framework, which is also lacking in the country. So one of the consequences is that there is no data classification. So it is not possible to say what data has to be treated with what level of confidentiality. Therefore, the tendency of the government departments is to treat the entire data as confidential, which is indeed restrictive for digital trade and digital business. On the other hand, amusingly, people use Gmail for their email. A lot of people in very sensitive places use Gmail. Anyway, so in order to overcome such constraints, private businesses keep their data with companies outside Pakistan. Amazon Data Services is an amazing service and quite very competitive. There is also ownership of data overlap among organizations, again, like PRAL, NADRA, NITB, or provincial IT boards. So, and there is no one central body, that which keeps control or manages these organizations. So some legislation is needed for that also, so that there has been a talk of a national CIO, but we haven't seen much on that also. So maybe some legislation, if that can enable this, overcome the issues which are related to 18th Amendment, and bring some sanity in the way the IT is managed across the country. I think I'll stop there. It's more than 10 minutes.
Thank you, Professor. Very insightful, and thank you for touching upon a host of issues. And of course, I think I'll take lead from the last point around the legislation, and probably just sticking on that last point.
I'd like to allow the opportunity to Ms. Saira Khalid, who's a lawyer in this space, to come in and elaborate her initial thoughts. Saira Sabha, please.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Saira Khalid. I think there's some technical error in my connection. So basically, I've been asked to touch up on 3 questions, which I will first deal with the legislative and the regulatory requirements on transfer of data, data retention, and data protection. So basically, like Sir Iftikhar just touched up on the data protection, personal data protection bill, which has not come to light as of now. But unfortunately, we're still working on that. And so basically, the bill has not been tabled before the National Assembly or the Senate for its approval. The Constitution itself, the Constitution of Pakistan itself talks about the fundamental rights to privacy, as it's mentioned under the Article 14. Then moving on, there's also a protection provided in Pakistan as per the law, the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act 2016, which is the primary legislation in respect of the data protection. And this was promulgated on the 18th of August 2016. PICA aims to prevent unauthorized act with respect to information system and provides for related offenses as well as mechanisms for their investigation, prosecution, trial, and international cooperation. PICA itself is a punitive law. It provides only the data protection bill, which will hopefully other information, and it also provides a lot of more protection in that aspect. Moving on, I'm just going to talk about the regulatory bodies as in Pakistan. The Personal Data and the Personal Data Protection Authority of Pakistan was established, will be established after the data protection bill comes into light. There's no regulator as such as of now. Currently, as per the PICA rules, as per the PICA Act, the FIA, which is the Federal Investigation Agency, has been appointed by the federal government as the investigation agency for the purposes of investigation of offenses. Additionally, PICA itself provides rights, it gives right to PTA, which acts as the authority regulating certain rights protected under the PICA. But we don't have a regulator as of now in relation to data protection. Now I'm going to touch up on I'm going to deal with the 3 questions which have been asked. That is the data protection. PICA, it basically means whoever gains to information of any data subject, or they copy the data in an unauthorized manner, will be punishable. As already I've mentioned that it's a punitive law. However, under the data protection bill, pursuant to Section 5 of the bill, it talks about a data controller which shall not process the personal data, including sensitive personal data, of the data subject unless the data subject actually consents to the processing of the personal data. So consent is one of the most important aspects to the data protection bill. Touching up on section 33 of the bill, it states that the authority is the main body which will be responsible to protect the interest of the data subject and enforce protection of the personal data, of the person's personal data, the data subject's personal data, and prevents any misuse of the personal data. It also promotes awareness of the personal of the data protection and shall entertain complaints under the bill if need be. Then I'm going to touch upon the transfer of data. Now, again, I've just previously mentioned that consent is one of the most important parts of the data protection bill. And as per section 12 of the bill, it provides that the personal data shall not be transferred to any unauthorized person. The personal data of the data subject the data subject's consent is required in any case. Then data retention as per PICA, it just touches up on a bit about the data retention bit, which is that a service provider, it can be PTA for that matter, shall retain its specified traffic for a minimum of 1 year. Or such person, any person's consent, until and unless the other person consents to it, they can retain the data for 1 year. And the authority, for example, PTA may notify that this personal data can be retained for a longer period, more than a year. Data be retained longer or should not be retained longer than it's necessary. It basically depends on the data controller. If the data controller thinks that that the information or the data subject is not comfortable with sharing his data, then they will retain the data, or for that matter, they can delete the data on request of the data subject. Then moving on to the second question, which is the constraints for Pakistan in transitioning towards the digital trade. Now, unfortunately, there's a mental block that Pakistanis have. When we talk about digital trade, right? So basically, we these days want something which is a physical transaction. We want something which is tangible. We don't trust the digital trade as of now, and that can be basically maybe because of lack of knowledge, or there's the literacy rate is required to be, it's also a barrier in that manner. There's also a language barrier. People are not comfortable with digital trade. Now, there's also consumer protection, which can also be, consumers aren't comfortable sharing their details. For example, many at times I'm not comfortable sharing my details while I'm buying something, my credit card details. Sometimes there are issues when I order something and what has been delivered is not the thing that I ordered for. Now, in that aspect, it's the consumer protection itself is a provincial matter. So, for example, if I, let's suppose, order something from Pakistan, from Islamabad, and it comes from Karachi, then I have to file a suit in Karachi because it's a provincial matter. So that's something which is a bit of an issue, which is why people are not really comfortable with the digital trade. Then also, again, the personal data protection bill has still not seen light, unfortunately. Touching up on the third question, which is what legislative gaps exist to improve the foreign investments in digital and IT space in line so basically, moving on to the answer. So you know how abroad there are a lot of people giving incentives to people who want to invest in their countries, right? I've dealt with many companies who want to invest in Pakistan. They want to register their branch office. Now, unfortunately, the Board of Investment in Pakistan, they're not very cooperative. They'll make things really difficult for all the businesses to register themselves over here. Then there's no law as to regulate the e-commerce in Pakistan. Now, you can't only protect the consumers, you have to protect the e-business owner. So if foreigners want to invest in Pakistan, for that matter, then they have to also be feel comfortable that in case if there's any dispute in future, they can file a suit or they can be protected in that manner. There's also, like I've just already said, there's no incentive. Many a times we've applied for the MVNO licenses or MNO licenses to PTA, and it's really expensive. So people don't, it's become more expensive. I think last year they increased their amount. I don't know the figures, but they've increased their amount of the licenses issued by PTA. Then there's also political instability, unfortunately, which is why foreign investment is, foreigners are, they refrain to invest in Pakistan. Political instability leads to then this, the European stability, for that matter. Also, going into litigation in Pakistan is a very long, drawn-out process. So people refrain from that. So there's no protection provided to foreigners to invest in Pakistan. Moving on, so basically these are the main issue is, first and foremost, I'll just touch base on everything. First and foremost, the data protection bill has to take place in Pakistan in order for the foreign investments to feel comfortable and come into Pakistan to sort of feel secured. Then moving on to the second question, which is the second question which I just touched base on, is the mental block. The people are not comfortable with digital trade as of now. They think the tangible paper is more, they trust it because they have evidence and proof available with them. So that's about it. If there's any question in relation to my... Yeah.
Really appreciate Ms. Saira Khalid. I think this was really in-depth, and thank you for touching upon all these three very important matters. And I think I will go back on them from our and have a response on this from our panelists from both the Ministry of IT and PTA as well. But before I go to Arif Saab and Usman Saab, I first want to give a brief opportunity to our colleagues from the World Bank who have done this very interesting survey around the preparedness and readiness of Pakistani firms and how prepared they are for the digital transformation and how COVID-19 has sort of encouraged this transition. And we would also be interested to know from them if there are any constraints that the firms are facing at this stage. And then probably I think we'll go to a response from our colleagues from the government. So may I request Rafis from the World Bank to start, and then I think Mr. Gonzalo would also like to add to that. So Rafis, over to you.
Can you see me and can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, phenomenal, perfect. Thank you so much, Waqar Saab. Thank you to everyone who's participating in the session today. So I'll be talking about a survey that we undertook in the months of June and July, the COVID crisis on the private sector in Pakistan. Once I'm done talking about the survey, then I think my colleague Gonzalo Varela is going to be talking about some of the work that he's done on digital trade and services trade in Pakistan, what the constraints are, what the opportunities are, and what the government needs to do going forward to unlock this space. But going back to this survey, so this was a survey, as I mentioned, which was undertaken in the months of June and July 2020, again, to determine the impact of the COVID crisis on the private sector in the country. We surveyed a total of 1,515 firms operating across the economic spectrum in Pakistan in different sectors. These were firms which were of different sizes, so small, micro, medium, and large-size enterprises operating in different sectors across the economy. Again, the purpose being to determine the impact of the crisis on the private sector in the country. Now, we know that a lot of surveys have been carried out over the last few months to determine the impact of the crisis on the private sector. This includes surveys which were done by Karandas, Pakistan, by SMEDA, and both of these surveys showed that the impact has been large, the impact has been cataclysmic, and the impact has taken a substantial toll on the private sector operating in the country. We also know that a lot of other specific niche surveys have been carried out by institutions like the University of Oxford and IGC, focusing on particular sectors or focusing on particular segments of the private sector. The University of Oxford, in collaboration with IGC, for instance, undertook a survey to determine the impact of the COVID crisis on micro enterprises in Pakistan. This was a particularly important survey primarily because micro enterprises account for the vast majority of all the firms that are operating in this country. And this survey, by the way, showed, this was undertaken in the month of April, this survey showed that micro enterprises had lost 90% of their sales as a result of the crisis, which is massive, especially considering that these firms do not have any financial buffers whatsoever. So where this survey stands out from some of the other surveys, where we've taken it up a notch, where we've amped things up a bit, there are three things where the survey stands out. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, the reason why this survey stands out is because the results are representative for the private sector in its entirety, as opposed to focusing on a subset of the private sector, as opposed to the results being representative of the sample of firms which were surveyed. The results are representative for the private sector in its entirety, and we ensured that by using robust statistical methodologies and sampling methodologies. Secondly, the reason why this survey stands out is because it was carried out later in the crisis. As I mentioned earlier, it was carried out in the months of June and July. So it doesn't necessarily just give you the impact at the height of the crisis back in the months of April and May, but it gives you the aggregate impact over a period of 4 or 5 months, which I think is important because it gives you an idea of how the private sector has been impacted by the crisis overall, all in all, over the last few months. And then thirdly, and also quite importantly, the reason why this survey stands out in comparison to some of the other surveys is because, as opposed to just measuring the impact of the crisis on the private sector, we've also studied how firms have responded, how they've adapted, how they've taken up digital technologies, how they've increasingly taken up sales through digital platforms to respond to the crisis and to survive the crisis. So before we talk about digital adaptation and how firms have invested in digital technologies as a response to the crisis, let me just digress a little bit, Waqar Saab, if I'm allowed to, just for 2 minutes or so, to give you an overarching view of what the survey tells us and how steep and stark the impact has been. So in a nutshell, the impact has been large. It's been absolutely massive. To give you an idea, only 28% of all the firms which we surveyed, and this is 1,515 firms, only 28% of these firms were operational, fully operational in the months of June and July. The vast majority of firms were either operating under reduced operations. They were, this is about 51% of firms, they were either temporarily closed or they were permanently closed. And a total of 9% of firms reported being permanently closed as a result of the crisis. In all likelihood, this number in reality is much larger because we couldn't reach out to all the firms which had already closed operations just because they had closed operations, right? So it gives you a sense of how steep the impact has been, more so because in the months of June and July, most of the restrictions that had been imposed by the government had been earlier in the crisis had been removed. And despite all that, only a third of all firms were fully operational in the months of June and July. So it just gives you a sense of how large the impact has been and what its intensity has been. This impact on the operational status of the firms cascaded down into an impact on their sales. And again, the impact on sales was also exceedingly large. 68% of all the firms that we interviewed and surveyed through this particular exercise reported that their firms, that their sales had gone down. And the quantum of the decline was equally large in the sense that on average, firms reported that their sales had gone down by 30%. Now that's an absolutely massive number, but I think it's important to caveat this particular statistic with the fact that the impact was highly differentiated in the sense that micro enterprises and small enterprises and enterprises operating in the retail sector and the services sector were much more significantly impacted by the crisis as opposed to firms operating in the manufacturing sector or exporting firms. So the impact was highly differentiated. Now the impact on sales further cascaded down into an impact on employment. And what we found here through the survey was really interesting in the sense that economists, when the crisis started, economists predicted that the economic impact would be massive, the impact on employment would be absolutely massive. And that is the case, but for the most part, firms have adopted and deployed much more flexible labor adjustment mechanisms as opposed to much more rigid and much more harsher employment adjustment mechanisms. What I'm referring to is layoffs. So only 13% of all the firms reported that they had laid off their employees. In comparison or in contrast, 41% of all the firms that we surveyed reported that they had either reduced the wages of their employees, they had either reduced the hours of their employees, the hours that they were working, or they had sent their employees on unpaid or paid leave. So it gives you a sense of how large the impact has been, but at the same time how firms have adapted and adjusted using flexible adjustment mechanisms as opposed to more rigid mechanisms. Only 3% of the total labor force that was covered as part of this survey, and we covered about 54,000 people, 54,000 employees of different establishments. Only 3% were laid off as a result of the crisis, which I think, it's a large number. There's no denying that. But in comparison to some of the other countries, I think Pakistan has come out of the crisis relatively unscathed as compared to some of the other countries, especially in the developed world. So the impact, in a nutshell, has been large. It's been absolutely massive, and the private sector is struggling despite all the improvements over the last few months. Again, it's not all doom and gloom. There is a silver lining in all of this. Yes, the impact has been large. Yes, livelihoods and lives have been compromised as a result of the crisis. But there's a silver lining in all of this. Silver lining being that the crisis had catalyzed digitization and digital adaptation in this country. And that's exceedingly important because I think the uptake we've witnessed in the last few weeks, especially over the last 8 weeks, is an uptake that we wouldn't have seen in the next 2 or 3 years had it not been for the crisis. So this is an opportunity that the government needs to seize to push the digital agenda, to push digital platforms, to push digitization in the country. To give you an idea, 51% of all the firms that we surveyed reported either increasing the use of digital platforms to undertake their business or starting the use of digital platforms to undertake sales. Now that's an absolutely massive number. 51% of all the firms that we surveyed, that's a large number. And this was across the board, right? So firms operating in different sectors, firms of different sizes, this digitization has taken place across the board, across the economic spectrum. And not only that, a number of firms have also reported investing in digital infrastructure as a result of the crisis and in adapting and adjusting to the crisis. So a total of 30% of firms reported that they had invested in digital infrastructure meaning computers and other things to undertake their business online through digital platforms, e-commerce platforms, or their own websites as a response to the crisis. At the same time, a lot of firms have repackaged their goods. They have started preparing goods which they weren't preparing before. And I'll give you a very interesting example. In February of this year, Pakistan was a net importer of masks. As of April this year, Pakistan is a net exporter of masks. So it just tells you how quickly firms have adapted and adjusted, and how flexible and nimble some of these firms have been and how resilient they are, right? So there's a silver lining in all of this. There's no denying that the impact has been large, but at the same time, silver lining being that the crisis is catalyzing digitization, it is catalyzing resilience, and I think there's much more that we're going to see in the coming months. Having said that, I think what's important to note is that the adoption of digital technologies has been quite heterogeneous. And what that basically means is manufacturing firms, exporting firms, and large-sized firms have reported digital adaptation at much higher rates in comparison to smaller firms, micro-sized firms, or firms which are not exporting. And there's a reason why, right? Because larger firms, those which are exporting, or those which are operating in the manufacturing sector based on our work, based on anecdotal evidence, and also based on the survey, have higher firm capabilities. They have greater technical know-how to undertake digital adaptation and adopt digital technologies, and also because they have the financial buffers to actually invest in digital technologies. These are things that micro enterprises simply did not have and do not have. So what does this mean in terms of policy implications? I'm sorry, can you still see me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So what does this mean in terms of policy implications? As a starting point, I think it's important to realize that things have changed for good. Yes, COVID, the virus might go away, especially with all the work that's been done on vaccines and all of the research work that's been done. It might go away eventually, inshallah. But at the same time, things have changed for good. COVID has changed the operational models of businesses around this country, not just operational models of businesses, but it has also fundamentally transformed how consumers engage with suppliers, with firms, right? I can give you anecdotal evidence. I can talk about my own family, my own parents who had never used the internet to procure items, to buy groceries, to buy clothing, and they are doing that right now. So it's a fundamental sea change in behavior, which we've witnessed in a period of literally 8 weeks or so. So these things will stay. And I can also give you evidence which was based on a survey which was carried out by the McKinsey Institute, and this was a survey that was administered around the world, which basically says that 75% of all the new users of digital platforms and e-commerce platforms will continue using these platforms going forward, even if things improve and even if things change. So things have changed for good. And this is particularly important to note because going forward, the government will need to support the private sector. The government will need to support the entire economy, in fact, to digitize and to adopt digital platforms. But it would need to do that taking into account two big things. The first being that the crisis manifested itself through different channels, as opposed to just being a supply shock or a demand shock or a tightening of credit markets. It was a confluence of different shocks. So that needs to be taken into account in the design of policies. Secondly, the government needs to be exceedingly cognizant of the fact that the impact has been differentiated in the sense that larger firms, for instance, or manufacturing firms or firms which are exporters have adopted digital technologies at a much higher rate than smaller firms. So they need to take that into account when they're designing their policies and especially reach out and put more emphasis in reaching out to micro enterprises and small enterprises to ensure that the playing field remains level. And that's extremely important because if we don't do that, then over the next few months, what we're going to witness is an increase in inequality, an increase in this difference between micro enterprises and large enterprises. There are three areas that the government needs to focus on going forward in giving more impetus to the digitization agenda. Firstly, they need to provide infrastructure to these firms, right? Because there are a lot of second-tier and third-tier cities in this country which do not have access to broadband. They do not have access to the fundamental infrastructure that's required to establish a digital presence. Secondly, you need to invest in skills, and that's also critically important because insofar as larger enterprises are concerned, they have all the skills in the world. They don't need your help. But insofar as micro enterprises are concerned and smaller enterprises, I'm talking about the Kiryana store walas, I'm talking about the dhabe walas, these individuals need the skills to actually establish a digital presence, and they don't have that right now. So you would need to think about how you can reach out to these firms and how you can support them in basically building up their skill set. And then thirdly, you need to give financial incentives to firms to adopt digital technologies. And that's, again, I think this is something that's critically important. The government has announced a lot of fiscal measures, a lot of packages. This is something that perhaps the government can work on going forward to ensure that we don't lose this momentum. Because if we do, then Pakistan is, again, in the coming years going to be a laggard. And we can't afford that given the current economic environment. So I'll stop there and give the floor to my colleague, Gonzalo Varela, who can perhaps talk about some of the work that he's done on digital trade and services trade. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael, and thank you, Wakar, for this invitation. I'm going to be very brief because, well, in the interest of time, and I think because a lot of the things that I was planning to say were actually already said. So what I'm going to say is, in conjunction to what my colleague Rafael was mentioning before, in a way, technology made digital trade possible, and COVID made it inevitable, right? So what we see is that all these firms in Pakistan have to embrace, not all did it in the same way as Rafael was explaining, but many firms joined digital platforms out of need. And I think the world has, the way the world has evolved, it has showed that a process that was a natural process that was going to happen at some point was accelerated due to COVID, right? So can Pakistan take advantage of this digital trade wave or not, and what are the issues that they're facing? So in the World Bank, what we did about 6 months ago was a survey of about 800 IT and IT-enabled services providers, some of which export, some of which don't export, to try to understand what their challenges were. So this was a pre-COVID work. The report is online, Digital Pakistan, a trade and business analysis. And basically, I'm going to bring in 3 things that came up as challenges that firms in this sector face in Pakistan. The first one is something that has to do with infrastructure. So this affects digital trade in general. So it affects digital services trade, but it also affects e-commerce within Pakistan, right? So when things are traded, like actual things are traded through online platforms. And this has to do with the fact that only 17% of the population used internet in the last 3 months. And even if you look at the top 20% of the distribution of income, so the richest 20%, only 44% of them used internet in the last 3 months, according to the last household survey that we have. So what that is showing is that there is a digital divide in terms of access to infrastructure, to connectivity infrastructure, and connectivity infrastructure is going to be the new trade barrier in the 21st century, right? So improving connectivity infrastructure is, I would say, the #1 priority if the government wants to jump into this digital trade wave. Now, the second issue that firms identified as problematic in our survey has to do with payments and taxes. And this was mentioned before. But one thing that we know is that the digital trade sector, the sector that trades IT and IT-enabled services, is much larger than what the statistics show. The statistics show about $1.5 billion of exports a year, whereas true exports are probably a multiple of that. Pasha will say 2 or 3 times that. Problem is the challenges that firms have in bringing in payments into Pakistan due to foreign exchange restrictions imply that they end up parking the funds elsewhere, setting up firms in other countries and parking the export proceeds elsewhere. So if Pakistan wants to take advantage of these increased exports and wants to be able to some extent tax them, it will have to relax some restrictions on the inflows of foreign exchange, right? So firms that receive payments need to convert dollars into rupees within a week. And if they need to subcontract abroad, they will need to make payments in dollars to these subcontractors abroad. They will need to convert into dollars again, and that can create losses of about 10% or up to 10% of their income. So that is a restriction that SDPI should take note and reconsider what is happening there. There is another problem that has to do with visas and work permits. This is something that is to some extent beyond the capacity of the government of Pakistan to alter, because it has to do with the difficulties that Pakistanis have to get visas to travel abroad. And when it comes to digital trade, this is a crucial element, to be able to see your client in person and then come back and work from home. So that issue will require active diplomatic efforts, but it's not something that necessarily is within the power of the government of Pakistan. And the last element that I wanted to mention, it has to do with consumer protection and data privacy. It was discussed before. I think it was Saira that discussed it quite nicely. But actually, this issue of consumer protection is crucial for the emergence of digital trade in a sustainable manner. So I will stop here, and I'm happy to take questions if they come. But I think those are the main 3 issues around boosting digital trade in Pakistan. Over.
Thank you, Gonzalo, and thank you, Rafe, as well, for highlighting these survey findings. Very relevant to discuss them at this stage. And also, I think our colleagues would be very interested in the digital trade report, which you have cited. We'll drop the link in the chat box. I think let me now turn to our colleagues from the government. I think this is the right time to bring them so that they can not only respond to some of the comments, some of the observations on the subject, but also have a more forward-looking approach in their deliberations as to how they plan to take this digital trade agenda forward. I do understand that the government is very keen. Government's manifesto is fairly clear on this. So maybe I would first request Usman Nasser Saab for his interventions.
Assalamu alaikum ji. Hello everyone. Yeah, I've been here listening to to our colleagues, and I've been crossing out the issues I was going to highlight because most of them been highlighted. And conscious of time, I would keep it very concise. the first of the questions is that what are the regulatory issues encountered by the foreign investors coming into Pakistan? So first and foremost is the lack of having a venture capital policy or a investment policy into technology sector. That is being one of the impediments. We do not know how to handle international VCs when something goes wrong. We do not know how to compensate people. We do not know how to do insurance of these issues. So we are tackling some of these elements. The second biggest problem is the visas for the Pakistani workers. And if you are opening up an office, being let's say a Netherlands company, opening up an office in Pakistan, excellence center, you want your staff to go to Kuwait. That's going to be very, very difficult for the staff member. The intellectual property rights, the definition of that, and how to implement these IP rules and IP regulations, actually carrying out a legal framework around it, and getting a decision based on these regulations. That's one of the issues that's been highlighted in our deliberations with the industry as well. The other problem is the inconsistency of taxation, definition of taxations, and the BPM codes and the tax codes across multiple taxation authorities of Pakistan. So in case of Sindh Revenue Board, they have a different definition of IT-enabled service compared to that of State Bank. Similarly, the definition of a BPO and a call center is although they often end up doing the same thing, at most of the times BPO is probably in a superset of a call center, but that definition does not include that understanding that BPO is the superset of a call center. The other problem is that Pakistan has very little dual tax treaty or double tax treaties with international with other countries, and we've been working on a policy of using Pakistan as a springboard operations. What I would like to highlight is that Pakistan, most of us are aware, that we are sitting on a geographical jackpot. We are 5 hours behind Melbourne, and we are 5 hours ahead of London. So we are smack in the middle. And that is a great opportunity, actually. If we can, for instance, if a company from Romania wants to do business with a company in Malaysia, they probably have to have a staff, have a list of staff who would cater for that time difference. People sitting in Pakistan, they can do this on both the ends. Similarly, a company from Indonesia can do business with a company in Malawi by sitting in Pakistan. Why would they do that? As I explained, the geographical jackpot that we have, number one. Number two, the government is allowing, if it's a export business, the government is allowing exemptions on taxations, 100% repatriation of profit and capital. And then the quality of HR is quite equivalent to other similar competing countries. One of the biggest hurdles in doing so is our ability and the pace of going and getting those double tax treaties done between those two countries. If we see a volume happening between Netherlands and Malaysia, and we can facilitate that volume, if we can sign double tax treaty with Netherlands and with Malaysia, we can act as the country where they would like to build from. Given that we have such taxation relaxation on export services. The other problem is the implementation of laws and getting a case in courts to be settled in time. That should not take more 3 years, 4 years, 5 years sort of struggle in the court of law. That is one of the issues that deters a lot of people from investing in Pakistan. And the last thing on my list would be the ability to raise capital from inside Pakistan. If you are a foreign investor coming into Pakistan, you probably find a couple of angel investors who like to work with you, but that's not feasible going forward, because a lot of equity has to be sacrificed in that case. So there is no particular forum where you can actually go, and mind you, a lot of businesses, a lot of IT businesses are not attractive to VCs. There are a lot of IT businesses which are run-of-the-mill 30% year-on-year margin sort of a business. So that's not exciting for the venture capitalists. So PSEB is working on a proposal for getting a private trading index at the Pakistan Stock Exchange. So that's one of our plans, and that would just be for the technology companies. So the idea is to bring on a few technology companies, put them into a pre-IPO phase, where their shares can be traded on by the mutual funds and large investors, but not on the floor. We train them for 3 years, along with PSX, for 3 years for those regulations to become an IPO, to do an IPO, to become a public company. For these 3 years, they would carry on the AGMs, the fiscal responsibilities, and board meetings, and they get that discipline. Once that discipline is in, for 3 years, whoever's been following the law to the letter, they would then be asked to join and if they're willing, they're asked to then go into an IPO mode. So these are the few issues that I see, other than the ones being highlighted by our colleagues earlier. The hurdles faced by the Pakistani firms, that's the next question for exporting the computer services abroad. There are a lot of remits that the State Bank has recently passed in favor of the exporters. However, the problem is that the implementation of those policies at the commercial banks level. Now, the commercial banks are not willing to implement a lot of those, and one of those is you can raise capital by through your or you can raise financing through your export orders, your brand equity. But unfortunately, a lot of commercial banks are not willing because they do not have the capacity and the capability to understand these IT products. B, they do not understand how come a piece of software is being sold for $3 million. There's nothing to export, and they often, when you go to a manager of a branch, all of a sudden something which looks like no-brainer becomes a big issue. So our idea for that is to consider is to go work with a state bank and propose them a specialized digital branch or branch for digital businesses for each of the major banks in most of the cities, Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad, and beyond. And that would help them, I believe. That would, and this the staff hired by these branches can be specialized IT personnel with business acumen and with banking experience. They would probably be be able to understand what's happening, why the LC of this particular item and how is being opened and how it is being how it should be handled. That's not the case with most of the commercial bankers. The other problem for them is that if they forward any financing to young entrepreneurs, they struggle to understand their business model. They struggle to understand how come a company which is doing $50,000 or $100,000 in sale has attracted this much money from the venture capitalists, and they are betting that this company would be doing $5 million in about 2 years' time. So that's why banks are very reluctant to, because they do not understand it. They are not willing to understand it. It is work. It is difficult. They often don't do it. The issue of the 35% retention of the 35% foreign exchange by the Pakistani exporters, that I believe that is slightly, although it's now being permitted, but it's not enough. What most people do not understand, that 35%, that it does not mean 35% of, let's say, $100,000 worth of sale does not necessarily means $35,000 in bank account. Most of these IT companies contracts are 30, 40, 30 payment terms. So you sign a work order, you'll be very lucky to get 30% of the money as mobilization advance. Now that means if the purchase order was worth $100,000, you're probably getting $30,000 in your bank account, out of which you'll probably be able to retain 35% in foreign exchange, which is $11,000 approximately. Now, if you have to send a team of 4 people to Netherlands to implement that project, that $11,000 are not going to be enough to cover for their travel expense, for their hoteling, let alone doing anything else. And then you do 6 months of work. Meanwhile, at some milestone, you get another 40%. Those 40% equate to another $14,000 at 35% value. And then after delivering the project, you stay on with the project, you pass on the technology. It takes another 3 months post the end of the project, and that's when if everything goes well, that's when you get the remaining 30%. Now, imagine yourself being in that situation and being the CFO of such a business, and try to run that distressed model of cash flow throughout every single project of yours. And you end up realizing that you end up doing a lot of bridge financing to just sustain this business. So that's why a lot of exporters, they have those companies abroad, let's say in Delaware, in Estonia, in Ireland, in Dubai and Singapore, because they would park this money there. They'd be able to very quickly send and receive amounts in those countries. And most of the transactions are done from there. So we have asked the State Bank of Pakistan to look into this matter as well. We've been requesting them because unfortunately, in our effort to retain foreign exchange, we are creating policies which is actually making it much harder to retain foreign exchange. So that needs to be looked at. The perception issue for a Pakistani investor is one of for a Pakistani exporter is quite difficult to target, quite difficult to mitigate. But we don't see in written terms, but it happens in perception terms that people don't equate Pakistan with digital products and IT services. And I think the job of departments and organizations like my own is to go and work on that perception building and probably do this repetitively, not just one campaign and get done with it. So we're working on that too. You'll see some results coming soon. Although telecommunication is not my area right now, I have been associated with the telecommunication industry for a while, internationally and in Pakistan, and the problem with the telecommunication industry in Pakistan, it actually impacts the digital exports and the digitization of the country. So let's say you are a operator in Australia, and you are going to acquire a modem from Nokia from their website. Let's say the value of that modem is $100, and you are importing it into Australia. In that case, you probably be paying 5% duties. If that modem is coming from China because of the FDA agreement, you probably be paying $100, not a dollar on top. Being a operator in Australia, your average revenue per user per month is somewhere around $24. Now, come to Pakistan. You see the same, you are an operator in Pakistan, you see the same modem, you're trying to import it into Pakistan, you end up paying 142% of the value. So you end up paying $142 for that $100 device. And your average revenue per user is somewhere around $2 or maybe lesser than that. Now, try and do a business plan based on that. It becomes very, very hard. A, B, what we often do not understand that I would probably go a bit deep dive into modern monetary theory, but I would leave it to Sargana Saab to please help us on that. That a limited implementation of modern monetary theory onto just the IT sector, limiting it just to that domain, would probably help us a bit. We have to think differently in those terms. A lot of people would criticize this comment and say, well, we can't print money. Absolutely, you should not. But the idea is that if the money that you are printing or money that you are using as a stimulus into a particular industry, which does not equate too much of foreign exchange inflation, then I think it's not a bad idea to do so. If we can give tax breaks and aggressive tax breaks, and we get behind our IT industry, and we say, okay, look, for every $100 that you are bringing in export remittance, your cost is $10 in terms of foreign exchange requirements. So yes, if we can establish that fact, then we can say that, well, we can probably give a bit of tax breaks to this industry. We can go and reward the industry for exporting. Right now, there is a proposal on the table for giving 5% cash rewards to any IT exporters, but and I think Bangladesh is right now doing 10%. Now, if we do 5% and we ask somebody to register through our systems, their impact on registration is 6.6%. And then we are giving them 5% in cash reward. So they are actually negative of 1.6%. If they do it through Dubai or Ireland or Singapore, they don't have to get through this mess. So we probably, while 5% is getting difficult to achieve, I believe 10% should be the minimum limit that we should be looking at. Yes, and we've been talking to AWS, we've been talking to the other companies who want to look into Pakistan, to come into Pakistan and use this as an operation center, excellence center. But they constantly come up with these two very issues, that the bandwidth is very expensive in Pakistan compared to the rest of the competing countries. B, we have they are unsure of how the legalities would be carried out, how the court orders would be ascertained. So yeah, these are the issues on top of my head.
Thank you. I really appreciate Usman Saab. I think this was really comprehensive, and it's really great to see that Pakistan Software Export Board already has some of these issues high up on the agenda, and you're looking into them. Maybe I think on the issues of telecom, which you also touched upon at the very end, and thank you for that as well. We can now go to Arif Saab, and I think our other panelists also had some of the inputs and suggestions for PTA. So it'll be now best to hear from Arif Saab, what's his take on these issues, and how does PTA now plan to take forward the reform measures in the digital trade space? Arif Saab, it's over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Waqar and SDPI, for providing this opportunity to listen the valuable input from the experts from different areas. And as far as the ICT or telecom sector is concerned, I'm here to, I may be able to respond some of the questions. So as discussed earlier, so briefly, I would talk about the digital infrastructure at the moment available in Pakistan and some challenges what we are facing. But before that, one or two points which have been raised, I just want to answer that. For example, the first question was raised by the respected Iftikhar Parvez Saab about the data storage in Pakistan. because most of the data now is being stored or through the cloud computing outside the Pakistan. And of course, which is not still in our purview, but we have already, as a PTA, at the PTA point, we have already started to engage with these players like Amazon and others. But just for your information, that PTCL, NTC, and CyberNet, they are offering the cloud computing services in Pakistan. So the data storage point, which was raised by the Iftikhar Saab, I just want to tell it. And the further, as highlighted by Ms. Saira Khan very rightly, that this storage and the data protection and all other points about the data will be taken care after the data protection law, which is under consideration. And I hope these things will be taken care of in this law once it gets light of the day, as Saira said. The second thing was that the PICA ordinance, which is being managed by the PTA as set by the Saira. So I just want to explain that some of the only are 3 or 4 clauses of these PICA, which are being managed by the PTA, which include to close the websites, for example, which involve in the anti-terror, anti-state activities, etc. Only that part, and rest of the PICA Act about the consumer protection is being managed by the Federal Investigation Agency. Some other points was for the payments and taxes. Of course, it's not in the purview of the Pakistan Telecom Authority, but just for the information of the audience, I would like to tell you that the payment system is already expanding in Pakistan. The digital sources, if you see that the transactions, the digital transactions are much more than millions and rather in trillions this year through the digital sources. And to further introduce the interoperability, we are working with the State Bank of Pakistan. We have already issued 2 licenses for the third-party service provider. Unfortunately, there are some of the issues going on in the litigation, and the case is still under the court. So once that is finalized, we hope that the digital inclusion and digital payments will flourish further. And the other thing is that the State Bank of Pakistan is also in the process to establish the micropayment gateway. Once it is finalized, I think the payment systems or digital payments will be very easy. So these were some of the points, but if you like, then you can put any question. I'm here and to answer your question. About the infrastructure, I just wanted to highlight that the government of Pakistan has issued the digital VN, the Digital Pakistan Policy, where it is VN that how the government is keen to expand this digital infrastructure. And it's already expanding very rapidly in Pakistan. And the results, as my friend Gonzalez has already mentioned in its report, that as a result, the IT and IT-enabled services export from Pakistan have increased to $1 billion in 2019 from the mere US dollar $433 million in 2010. So this is the results of the availability of the digital infrastructure, of course, with other some parameters available. Currently, I can say that more than 86% of the population in Pakistan is covered with the digital services, whether it's cellular mobile signals or the 3G, 4G signals. And, more than 40,000 towers, BTS have been installed all across the country. And Zong, out of which the Zong has about 11 or 12,000 towers, which all have been enabled for the 4G services all across the country. And therefore, the 4G services are increasing rapidly right now in Pakistan. Recently, the Pakistan has renewed the licenses of the 3 CMOs at the price of the $1.2 billion, and out of which more than 50% we have already received it. And they have made the commitment in this sector for next 15 years to stay here and provide the digital services to the people of Pakistan. Further, as far as the prices of the digital services are concerned, I can highlight that the recent report by the ITU has reported that the Pakistan market is offering the 1.5 GB data at the rate of just 99 cents, which is 44% less than India and 176% less than Bangladesh. So, the ITU has also rated Pakistan in terms of the affordability of the broadband services, ranked at the number 37, which is much better than India and Bangladesh, who were ranked 46 and at the number of the 46 and 91 by the ITU. So you can imagine that in terms of the affordability, we are also doing much better. About the broadband services, we have more than 81 million broadband subscribers right now in Pakistan. And if you see that for the last 5 years, the growth was about 157. And during the last year, the growth of this 3G and 4G subscriber is more than 18%, which was slightly slowed due to this COVID-19 breakout. So, but still it is very encouraging for us that the growth of the 3G and 4G. And the more interesting is that the migration from the 3G to 4G services is much more rapid, which means that the people are very prone to get the fast speed and fast internet, and we are very, very much encouraged for that. And right now, about the 39% is the penetration of the broadband services in Pakistan, which is mostly dominated by the mobile services, which count about the 80 to 90%. And fixed line services are a little bit slow. However, under the USF program, we are also in the plan to launch the fiberization program, that most of the fiber should be laid down in Pakistan for more reliable infrastructure in Pakistan. Similarly, I would say that some other data, I can present it here, that the data usage is also increasing by rapidly in Pakistan. And I have just calculated in last year, in 2020, 19 and 20, the growth in the data usage in Pakistan has been witnessed about 77%, which is again encouraging. And you can see from here that how much the infrastructure is expanding in Pakistan about the digital infrastructure. However, still even at the PTA and the government level, we consider that still there is a usage gap for the adoption of the broadband services. For example, the recent report by the PSLM survey by the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics, they have reported that 34% of the households have internet in their houses. But they have also reported the only 17% of the people, they used the internet in last 17 months, which is evident that the adoption is still, despite the availability of the digital infrastructure, the adoption is very low, which we need to, look into it. And Well, these are some of the points which I
Thank you.
highlight about the digital infrastructure available in Pakistan. And if you have any questions about it, I mean, broadly, I have just let you know that
Thank
what
you,
kind
Arif Saab.
of infrastructure is available. You can ask the question, anything I can answer.
No, thank you very much, Arif Saab. This was really helpful for our understanding. I really appreciate that you have brought in the perspective of PTA here, and also you have responded to several of the comments which have been given. I understand that we have a little less than 10 minutes left into the meeting. So what I wanted to propose was that if our panelists could look at some of the questions which have been posted in the chat box. And if you'd like to respond to any of those questions, you're more than welcome. So I would probably take another final round and go in the same order as we had started, and maybe give a minute each to each of our esteemed panelists for any of their final thoughts. Let me start with Parvez Iftikhar Saab.
Thank you very much. I think the presentations by all the panelists have been excellent, and they've added to the knowledge of all of us, especially the World Bank study. My only submission is that, as in the case of telecom, as Sagana Saab has very amply and very clearly shown that we are quite well placed. That is very much true. But unfortunately, others have been doing, probably putting in more efforts than we have. So therefore, when we compare ourselves with some of our peers, we do not appear to be that well placed as one would hope. For example, there's a Economist Inclusive Internet Index in which Pakistan is ranked at 76, below every country in the region except Nepal. There's a World Economic Forum Global Competitive Index 2019, where Pakistan is ranked as 110, and which is below every country in the region. Afghanistan is not mentioned, so I assume we're better than Afghanistan. Then there is a UNDECA e-government survey 220, where Pakistan is placed below every country in the region. The US UNDESA e-government survey has a telecommunication infrastructure portion also. So the infrastructure index is of 192 countries. Pakistan is placed below every country in the region. So it goes on. Network Readiness Index, 121 countries, Pakistan at 104, below every country in the region except Nepal.
Yeah.
ITU's ICT Development Index, September 2019, it was issued not too long ago. 176 countries, Pakistan is placed at 148, below every country in the region. So we need to do something more in case of,
Sure.
I know that we are doing, but we need to do much more. Thank you.
Thank you, Parvez Saab. Ms. Saira Khalid.
So thank you so much for taking me up on this discussion. Basically, there's no other way to improve anything in relation to digital processes to be improved. Is only we have to work towards encouraging, or the bill has to be passed as soon as possible for security to be there in Pakistan. And in terms of the regulators, I really hope that the regulators work with us to encourage the foreigners to invest over here. That's all. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Rafe?
Can you see me? Yes, I think you can. So just really quickly, Waqar Saab, just would like to echo what was said by Saira and Pravesh Saab before me. I think, this was a really interesting conversation. So thank you so much for the opportunity. The only point I would like to reinforce and reiterate is the fact that, digitization is taking place in this country. We've gained a lot of momentum thanks to COVID. This is pretty much the only silver lining that I see in this entire crisis. So we need to leverage and we need to seize this momentum. And I think that's where the government needs to come in and make sure that it provides all the enabling environment. This includes regulatory reforms, this includes the legislative framework, this includes the infrastructure and everything else, including skills to the firms of this country to ensure that we don't lose this momentum. Because as I said earlier, if we do lose this momentum, we're going to be laggards all over again, and we can't afford that given the state of the economy. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Gonzalo?
Yeah, so I would like to conclude by saying the best thing that the government of Pakistan can do to support exports of digital services is to remove all distortive regulations and to invest in public goods such as internet infrastructure. That way, the government can stay away from subsidies to exporters that are going to be more distortive, and instead focus on removing those restrictions that it imposes itself.
Thank you. Osman sir?
Yeah, thank you again. I think my closing remarks would be that we have to work on reducing the cost of doing business. And that we have to, while we offer great competitive advantages over a lot of other countries, these advantages somehow get subdued when it comes to policy in terms of taxations and duties. And I continuously fail to understand that why we go after the very money that we are printing ourselves, and we sacrifice the foreign exchange by doing so. So that's the one pertinent question I've been asking everybody since I've joined a month ago. And I believe as soon as I get the answer, I probably give you the answer as well. So that's my comment. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Usman sir. And Arif sir, before I hand over to you for your closing remarks, I think one of the questions that has been asked is regarding the role of academia in this space, and the fact that Pakistan has very enterprising individuals in the academia think tank sector who have been working in IT and telecom space. So while of course we request you for your closing remarks, but we're also interested on your comment about what may be the evidence or research related needs of PTA, which Pakistani academia or think tank sector could bridge, please.
Thank you, Dr. Waqar. Thank you very much in my closing remarks, and particularly for asking this question, that which are the areas of the research where we need to request the think tanks and the academia. As an economist, what I feel here is that the major problem facing the sector is the high taxes right now. If the Khar Sahib is already a member of the task force by the Prime Minister, and he knows much, that from other things, the taxes are major impediment for the growth of the sector. So what we require from the academia and think tank, that if we rationalize the taxes and harmonize the taxes in the telecom sector, what would be the impact on the economy? And what would be the usage, and how it would be the impact on the digital trade and digital infusion and some other things. So this is one of the area in the social sciences or the economic side. But there are some technical areas which maybe the technical people can explain further. What should I say? That the other things that academia and the researchers must see the impact of the cellular mobile expansion in Pakistan right now, and what is the way forward, and the policy requirement for the PTA. If the academia and research think tanks can guide us, and we are already working us, and this would be more helpful for us. to further the digital sector in Pakistan. I just would, in my closings, I would like to say that as I have already mentioned that we are trying our level best to expand the ICT infrastructure all across the country. And to some extent, we are, succeeded to provide the digital services in most of the areas. But as highlighted by the Parvez Saab, that in most of the indexes by the international organization like ITU, Economist, or blah, blah, where we have been ranked below in the rest of the countries or in the regions, I just want to like to highlight here that we are already in touch with the ITU and GSMA and some economists who have calculated these indexes. The problem is that because when they estimate these indexes, mostly there are the three parts. For the first one is the infrastructure, and the second is the access, and the third one is the usage and the skill level. Unfortunately, the skill level, most of these indexes, they don't have the data for across the countries, therefore they use the proxy. For example, the digital literacy, digital programs in the universities where we lack. But in terms of the infrastructure or access to the ICT, in all these indicators, we are much better and in a better place. But unfortunately, these some variables like education, digital education, skill level, etc. Those are the responsible to bringing us back in in these indexes. And we are trying our level best that we should improve in these indexes as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arif Saab, and let me thank the esteemed panelists as well as the attendees for today's session. Just 3 points from SDPI side that we will upload the proceedings of today's session, including, of course, the recording on our SEDI webpage on SDPI's website. Second, of course, this is a live resource, so in case you may have any afterthoughts or any further additions to make, please feel free to do so. We, of course, make it a point to send quarterly recommendations to the Commerce Ministry and FBR. So we are much pleased to see that tax-related discussion was a part of this dialogue as well. And for any clarifications, you're more than welcome to contact myself or Maz, who has been helping me coordinate this. So once again, on behalf of SDPI team, I thank all of you for your time and look forward to remaining in touch. Thank you.